right. Well, hello and welcome to the Version Control and Decisions webinar. As I mentioned earlier, I've shared a quick poll for you to fill out while we're getting started and going through a handful of announcements here at the beginning. So if you haven't answered that poll yet, please take this time to answer the questions while we introduce ourselves. So I'm your host, Veronica Hartless, and joined today with my colleague, Kyle Bachner.
Hello, everyone, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. So you may have noticed that we've had a bit of a facelift. With the new year, we now have a new logo and a new website. If you haven't checked it out already, feel free to go to decisions.com and see what all the hype is about.
Now, of course, for those of you that are new to Decisions or unfamiliar with Decisions, just to give you a little bit of background about the company, we are a business process management software that helps non-technical people to easily automate and optimize business processes without the need to code. On this slide, you'll see some of our current customers in the different sectors to give you an idea of where Decisions fits. We're equal parts rules engine and workflow. So there's lots of different problems that we can solve across industries.
And here are our lovely headshots. You can match a name with a face. We've had the pleasure of meeting a few of you on our webinars or over video calls, and we are about to discuss some of our upcoming events. So come and experience us virtually. We also welcome connections and questions on LinkedIn, so please feel free to add us there.
All right, so before we get too far ahead of ourselves, again, I'm going to end this poll here in about 30 seconds. So if you haven't had an opportunity to answer those couple of questions, feel free to do that while we go through our upcoming events. As we move through this webinar, keep in mind that everybody is muted. So if you have any questions, please feel free to send us those questions by either typing them into the Q&A feature or the chat. And we're going to be happy to answer those questions throughout the webinar so that we can answer those questions. Now, some of those upcoming events, we'll start out with next week. So next week on January 19th through the 22nd, we have a fundamental certification in Eastern Standard Time. This is a great opportunity for customers who want to either train up an internal champion for Decisions, as well as our partners looking to get certified. There are prerequisites for these courses, so please be sure to check those out and make sure that you're eligible to take the course. Now, of course, while that's occurring, the very exciting news is that our version 7 will be released to the public. Now, we're scheduled to be releasing that on January 20th. It should come out on that day, and of course, you can find that at releases.decisions.com. Of course, this is a beta version. So it's brand new, and I know a lot of people have been excited to get their hands on it. So I just want to put that out there that we should be seeing that out to the public here at the end of this month.
And the other events we have going on are January 26th through 28th. We have our beginner and advanced training. And do note that this is in the Australian time zone. So the beginner training is a great opportunity for new users to Decisions to learn how to use the platform. It's also a great way to prepare you for the fundamental certification if you plan on taking that course later in this quarter. That same training of beginner will be offered February 9th through 11th, this time in Pacific Standard Time. Beginner is the same course I mentioned before, and for those of you that are well-versed in Decisions and really want a challenge, be sure to sign up for our advanced training course. This will be related to understanding Decisions and its infrastructure, and the course will also look at creating project requirements, modeling projects and solutions, and advising on Decisions best practices and best implementation methods to help solve your problems or meet your requirements. This training course should be taken before you sign up for a professional certification. So we have a lot of opportunities to train virtually and safely anywhere you find yourself around the globe. So please be sure to sign up at decisions.com/events. When signing up, make sure you pay close attention to the time zone of the event you're signing up for, so you can be sure to get into the one that matches your location best.
All right, so without further ado, we've got through all of our announcements. We're going to go ahead and get started with why all of you have come here today. So we're going to talk about what we're going to be seeing. I have most people that voted in that poll. I'm going to be ending that poll here. I can see that it looks like we've got a very nice spread, almost a normal curve for all the math geeks out there like me. So it looks like we've got a couple of experts and a couple of people that have never used decisions, and almost an equal amount spread out between confident using decisions and new users, but have been using it for a few months. For the repository, again, it's kind of an even spread. Some people use it all the time. There's quite a few people that have never heard of the Designer repository. Some people that have heard about it, they've never actually used it, and some that are just trying to learn how to use it. So I'm going to end that poll, and I appreciate all those that have taken the time to answer it. I will have a poll at the end as well. But to talk about what we're going to be dealing with today, version control is something that people come to us here at Decisions, and it's something that they're really passionate about and need to make sure that we can provide the versioning that they need in their organizations. So today we're going to go through here at the start of the webinar, we're going to go through some of the things that we have right out of the box, looking at automatically the versions that Decisions is going to automatically create for you, and also checkpoints that you can create so that you can define different versions that you might want to be able to revert back to. We'll also talk about and show how to make copies. Sometimes you need slightly different versions that are available in the same environment, and because of that, we're going to need to have either copies or even use templates to help us with those. And then go into how do I move those versions from one environment to another. So if I, let's say, have been working in dev and need to, I finished up my version 2 of a certain form, how can I make sure that moves into my production environment or into that testing environment? So we'll take some time to go through all of the out-of-the-box versioning that's available here in Decisions. And then Kyle's going to take us into the Designer repository. This is actually another Decisions environment that'll allow you to check in and out resources so that you can have that repository keep track of all the different versions of all the different things that you have created in Decisions. Now, once we go through the repository, we'll also talk about other repositories that we can utilize. So if you're already utilizing a repository that's not Decisions, and you want to continue to use that, we'll talk about how we can do that as well. So let's get right into it. So we're going to start with talking about the history documentation. And I'm going to actually go into my local environment. So I'm going to click over to a new tab. And of course, here in my local environment. Now, the first thing you're probably going to notice is that my environment, in my opinion, might be a bit prettier than most. And that's because I've used our theme editor to change the color and make sure it says Veronica Studio instead of Decisions Studio. Of course, Decisions is completely customizable, so you can white label it, you can change colors, logos, make it what makes sense for your organization. And of course, I've customized mine. So when you are creating things in Decisions, now I'm going to be referencing things as resources. And when I reference the word resource, what I'm saying is anything you've created in Decisions. That includes workflows, rules, reports, forms, data types, folders, literally anything that you're creating here in the Decisions platform. So all of these resources that you're creating and potentially putting together as a project, you're going to have the ability to be able to deal with those different versions. Now, the first thing, as I mentioned before, that we want to talk about is the Office style autosave. As you're creating these resources, Decisions is actually going to be automatically creating backup versions for you. And so without you having to do anything, you actually are going to have different versions. So let's say if you completely broke a form, messed everything up, you might be able to go back into the history to revert back to where we were maybe at the beginning of today or at the end of the day yesterday. Now let's talk about how do I get to the history documentation. Now I'm in a folder right now here in my Designer Studio where I have a request form. And of course, I can right click right here in our Designer folder where that resource lives. And I have the ability to see a handful of actions, including a category called History Documentation. And when I hover over that action category, you'll notice a few other actions, including Open or View. And when I select Open View, what that's going to do is open up another tab automatically. And you'll have to forgive my slow laptop. But it's going to open up a new page where on the left-hand side, we see some information about the particular resource, an audit trail about when people made changes or did different things. But over here on the right-hand side, this is what I'm calling that office-style autosave. Decisions as you're creating and making edits and changes, in this case to a form, but of course, for any resource, decisions will make backup versions of that resource automatically. Now, I personally don't know what the algorithm is, how often it's going to take a backup. I find this option useful, but what I do find is that what's more useful is for me to be able to decide exactly when I want to take a snapshot of a particular version of this resource. So you have all the backup versions, and you can see I've got quite a few here for the backup of the request form that was automatic. But let's go ahead and close that. If, let's say, I want to take a particular snapshot, let's go into this actual form. The history documentation is available for us to be able to view those backup versions, but you'll notice this is a very simple form I created in Decisions. And again, I've customized Decisions. I changed the color so it's not orange. I don't have any CSS on here. I just made a little form background, but it's basically a mobile form. Now, of course, maybe I like the way this looks. I think I'm going to want to make sure I have this version as a snapshot. Maybe it's the end of the day. And so I want to make sure at the end of the day, all my developers take a snapshot of where you're at the end of the day. So if anything happens later, we could always have these points to revert back to. So up at the top, across the top, we have that orange actions bar, which I've turned gray. And that checkpoint, when you click on checkpoint, this is taking a snapshot of this designer. In this case, it's the form designer. This is what this form looks like at this time. And we'll maybe say, this is my mobile form, and we'll save that. Now, where do I see those checkpoints? Well, again, we see those in the same place we saw the autosave versions from Decisions in that history documentation. Another way to get to the history documentation is, again, in the actions bar, you'll have a history action. And clicking on that history action opens up that same window we saw before, only now you'll notice I have a checkpoint. My mobile form that I just created a second ago has that has a line item that I can revert back to at any point. Now, of course, you'll notice I've made a couple of other checkpoints along the way as well. So for instance, maybe I'm going to want to revert back. Instead of seeing this mobile form, maybe we want to go back to the desktop version. So I'm going to actually right click on here, again, where we have actions available that we can use, including restore from backup. So I can change this version where I'm at that mobile form, restore back from that to a previous version, and you'll notice it gives me a quick confirmation. Are you sure you want to replace this form with this backup version? I'm going to go ahead and say yes. Now, of course, it's going to document that I've reverted back to this other version. And I'm going to go ahead and close this. Notice that because I haven't done anything on this tab or on this Chrome tab, I'm going to close, not save, and go right back into that same form. All of a sudden, totally different version. Now, obviously, Decisions will create those backup versions for you. I would not rely on that. If you have a specific point in time you want to revert back, you want to use these checkpoints. Now, I get a lot of customers that come to us that say, you know what? I'd like to be able to have both versions of these forms available in this environment. One of the major things that you need to understand about decisions is that it recognizes all these resources, not by its name, but by its ID. So there's a form ID that goes along with this. And any resource in decisions can only have one version of it running at in any particular environment at a given time. So if I want that mobile version and this version of that same form, I'm going to need another option. And that's why the next thing that we went to talk about is copies. So let's go ahead and close out of this form. Obviously, this form is now the desktop version. So what I would like is to make a copy of this form. So I have the desktop version, but then I'd also like to have that mobile version. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click outside here in our designer folder. When I right-click onto that resource, we're going to hover over edit in this case, so the edit category rather than the history documentation. So I'm going to hover over edit, and what you'll notice is I have the ability to copy this form. Now, when I make a copy, let's go ahead and copy it. This was the desktop version, desktop form, we'll call it. I'm going to go ahead and click create. And of course, that's going to bring it in. I've just made a copy. That means I can make any changes I want to this form. It's not going to affect the original. So I can have different versions of the same form, but I don't have to start from scratch. Now, of course, now I have my desktop form. I might want to go back into my request form, go to that history, and of course, come back to and restore back to the mobile version. And as quickly as I did that, now I have the mobile version and I have the desktop form. So very, very quickly, I can make sure that I have the ability to revert back to different versions, but also if you need more than one version of the same resource, then we would need to use a copy. Now, the next option I want to also bring up is the fact that we have the ability to use templates as well. And when you want to use something as a template, let's say I want to use the request form as a template. So when I right-click on that resource, wherever it might live, it would live inside a particular folder. But again, you'd hover over edit, and underneath at the bottom where it says advanced, you have the ability to decide if you wanted a template. I've actually already made this a template. I can remove it. Let's remove it just so you can see that when I make something a template, I'll say make template. Are you sure you want to make it a template? Yes. And what that does is now anybody with permissions to this particular folder is going to be able to see the request form when they're trying to create a brand new form. So for instance, if I click create form at the bottom of my screen, I'm going to create a normal form. You're going to see the default. You're going to see a couple of the out-of-the-box templates that were available, but you'll also notice there's my request form. And of course, when I click on my request form and I click create, we'll go ahead and leave it called form 1, it gives me that starting point. So I can use that as a template. So I have this as a starting point and I can make any changes. Now, of course, if I make changes to this form now, does it affect the template? No. If I make changes to the template, will it affect this form? No, it will not. This is basically saying, I've made a copy of that template, and now I can just keep on making changes and do what I need to do. Now, I'm seeing, okay, there's a handful of questions coming in, so I'm seeing there's a lot of different things to answer. Instead of copy, can you create a copy from the version on the history list of the original instead of copying and rolling back? You don't have the option. So when I go into history of a particular, and this one probably won't have anything because I just created it. There is no history, but let's go back to a request form. When I go into that history, you'll notice that if I wanted to make a copy, you don't have that option from this history. So You are going to need to make a copy that either, the way I showed, taking that action by hovering over edit and make a copy, and then you can revert using the history of that item, just like you saw me do. Let's see, who can be restored forms be controlled through some kind of permission list? So with the permissions, you are going to be able to restrict what actions people have. So it depends on where that thing might live. If someone has permissions to that folder, if they do have designer access to a folder where they're allowed to edit, add, or delete, that would affect, then they would have the ability to make the copies. If they are not allowed, if they don't have the add permission to a folder, they wouldn't have that option as an action. So you would be able to control this through permissions if you need to. Now I'm going to go ahead and keep going. The one other thing I want to mention here that does come up a lot, and I didn't get the question right now, is what if I have a couple of forms that I have like different sections that are always the same? Let's say like I have a personal information section. That could include first name, last name, address line 1, address line 2, city, state, zip. We might have that personal information, and it's going to be the same on a whole bunch of forms. And maybe we know that there might be changes down the line that need to be made. We don't want to deal with having all these copies and making changes. How can we here in decisions deal with that without having to go into 30 forms or figuring out what copies have been made of this particular form? For that situation, I recommend utilizing things called user controls. A user control is actually kind of like a mini form. It's just a component that you can place on a form, just like a text box or a date picker. A user control you can place on a form, and I make that user control. It can be reused on multiple forms, but maybe if I need to make a change to that personal information, maybe I need to change the zip code from a 5-digit zip code to allow for the extra 4-digit extension. Or maybe we want to add their phone number as part of that personal information. You can use those user controls so that you can make that change in one place, and it's automatically applied to many different forms that utilizes that same information. So that's another option for people that run into not wanting to have a lot of copies of different versions of forms or whatever it is that you might be utilizing.
So Veronica, we know how to make copies and templates now, but what if I wanted to actually move those into another environment?
That is a great question. Thanks, Kyle. So again, when we're dealing with versioning in decisions, one of the things is that you might have multiple environments: a development environment, a testing, a UAT, staging, production. You can have lots of different environments, and you might want to move a certain version of either a single resource or an entire folder from one environment to another. Let's say I want to move this entire project into my production environment. We can say this is ready to go. How do I make that move? How can I make sure that we get this version of this project into the next environment? And there's a couple of ways that we can deal with this. So the first method that I'm going to mention is importing and exporting. Now, this is the most manual way that I'm going to be showing to move these different versions from one environment to another. So what I can do is either right-click either on the individual resource or any folder, and another category that you have available is this import-export option. Now, when we import or export, in this case, I'm going to be exporting it. I'm taking it from this environment and putting it into production. So we're going to export. And when I do that, what happens is we're going to be displayed a form that shows me any existing projects or to create a new project. In order to move any resource, any version, you are going to need to make sure it's part of a project. Now, it's important to keep projects, keeping the resources grouped together appropriately. I might call this my Bake Off 1 project. So I'm just going to call it Bake Off 1. We're going to go ahead and click Continue. And what it does then is display a form where I can see, do I want to just simply download just this folder? Do I want to download the entire project, so anything that is attached to the Bake Off 1 project? Or do I want to download the project with dependencies? And what you'll notice is that there's a quick little information that displays here on the right-hand side to give you a basic understanding of what that is. Now, of course, if you were to right-click and export a single item, it would just say, do I want the single item or everything in that folder? Of course, at the bottom, you have the option to be able to decide what should come with this. Do we want the subfolders underneath my Bake Off 1 folder? Do I want to include the dependencies? So if that form has a data flow or a visibility rule, should I have that come with it? Do we want to include or exclude the history folders or hidden items? So we decide what we want to bring. I'm going to click Continue. And what happens is I'm displayed a list of everything that I have in this project. And that includes permissions if they're applied. That includes data types, pages, anything that's part of that project. And you'll notice I have the ability to check or uncheck anything I want to be able to move. Sometimes you only want to move a couple of items. Now, if you were just moving a single item, you would get what we call a deck object file. But because I have a lot of items in this, what we're going to see, I'm going to go ahead and add these permissions, make sure it brings that with it. It's going to give me a download screen, and you'll notice that it takes all the deck object files and groups them all together into a nice zip file. So now I have the ability to be able to take that zip file and go to another environment. I guess I need to click over to somewhere else and import it in. Now, of course, the easiest way to import is just simply drag that entire zip file and drop it on top. And it's going to let me know, okay, do I want to import this? So if you're bringing in any resource, you would import. If you're just want to bring in, let's say, a document like a file or a company logo, an image, you might do it as a document. But for me, I'm going to import the project. And of course, what it's going to do is it's going to look at what's part of that project and determine if there's any issues. You're going to see, oh no, I've got lots of issues. And it's all the same issue, which I would expect. I wanted to be able to show something with issues so you could see what happens. The issue for mine is the fact that I went from a newer version of decisions into an older version of decisions. We don't recommend you do this. This is not a good practice to go backwards. I did it on this webinar only to show what you can do for issues. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, for me, I know that there's nothing in this project that is going to cause a problem. So I'm going to ignore those issues. And I could do that for all these different options, or you can add another file, you can exclude it, but I can also check a box to attempt similar fixes on the other items. And when I click Continue, it's going to try to apply those changes if possible. In my case, since they all were the same issue, it was able to quickly resolve all of them at once. So now you can see here on the left, a display of how many issues are found, how many resources. Well, there's 8 folders, 5 flows, 3 rules. You can see all the resources as a count, as well as the individual resources listed out here on the right-hand side. And I can complete that import. It's going to spin. It'll take a few seconds, and this might take a minute or so because there's a handful of items, but it will then appear here in our next environment. Now, as I wait for this, and it's going to just take a second, I do want to answer a couple of questions that have come up. Let's see here. If there is, I think I did answer all these, so I just haven't hit done. Perfect. So let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and come back over here. Now, that's pretty much it for the import and export. But let's talk about what is, that was the manual version of the movement. Of course, I could come back over here and actually see Bake Off 1, go into my forms. I should see my forms. I might have closed it before it was finished, so that's okay. Don't close it before it finishes. But I have that other version. In fact, I think it just finished. Yeah, it's finishing up right now, adding them all in. So now I have all of that project in this other environment. Like I said, this was a very manual movement. Most people don't like to have to do this manually like this. And so before I go into the next method, I do want to point out the downfalls of moving this manually. A couple of things that aren't great is that if you've deleted items will also come back and be here. You might want to have a cleaner version. And so from there, let's go ahead and talk about how that brings us to our Decisions Designer repository. And of course, for that, I'm going to actually switch over and have Kyle share his screen so that he can walk us through the Designer repository and how that actually relates to version control and decisions.
Thanks, Veronica. Can you just confirm that you can see my screen?
I sure can.
Okay, awesome. So we're just going to talk real quick about what the Designer repository actually is. And the Designer repository is a separate install of decisions that will act as a central location to store any of your projects. Now, the repository also has the ability to push and pull between different environments. So in other words, the repository is basically just a middle layer to help orchestrate getting projects from one environment to the other without having to manually do that import and export option. So what does the Designer repository actually look like? Well, here I am in our Designer repository that we have set up for this webinar. And you'll notice that it looks exactly like a normal install of decisions. I did change the title up here in my top bar, just so we know when I'm in the repository and when I'm in my studio. But it is just a separate install of decisions with this Designer repository folder that does all of the magic that we will be showing in a bit. So now that we know what the repository looks like, how can you actually connect to a repository? So I'm going to move over into my local instance of decisions. And just so you know, when we're in each location, my local has this upside down smiley face up here. In case you didn't know, emoji are Unicode, so you can use them in your titles. But anyways, we are talking about connecting to the repository. So under System, I'm going to navigate to Settings. And we have this option of Designer repository settings here. Now, I do want to note that you do have to have admin access in order to make these changes, but I'm just going to right-click on this and edit my repository settings. So we've already connected my instance of decisions to our repository, which is why we have this server already listed here in this URL area. You do have to have the primary at the end of the URL, so that way it knows to communicate with it. But we also have the option for different actions with these checkboxes. You're most likely going to want Show Repository Actions checked, because that will allow you to right-click on your projects and send those to repositories similar to an export or import and export. And we can also exclude unit tests or data structures from our repository. So if you had different unit tests in your production versus your dev environment, you can exclude those to make sure that you won't have any conflicting testing. So that is how you would connect to the repository. And now that we have seen that, let's talk about repository actions real quick. So when I right-click on one of my folders here on the left, under Designer repository, we will see this drop-down list of a bunch of different actions that can be taken. Now, the main ones that I want to point out are the check-in changes and the checkout updates. where this is the action that allows you to push and pull from the repository. We also have a few different other actions. If you wanted to see what the differences were between your local version and the repository, you could do that at a glance. And we also have the ability to revert changes you made or remove specific items from your project.
Kyle, I'm going to stop you right there because that actually brings up a question that was put in the chat about a project. Can an item be included in multiple projects? So when Kyle was just mentioning about to be able to add or remove an item from a project, it is important to note that you cannot have an item in multiple projects. Something can only be attached to one project at a time. So you would either want to create like a common project that might have the common items that are shared between multiple projects so that it gets moved into an environment before the actual projects are, or you can even create sub-projects as well, which we can talk about in a little while. But I think, as you saw, you could remove an item from a project that if you have it accidentally with a different project, or maybe you need it in more than one, you can add or remove it from projects so it's in the correct project. It cannot be put into both or more than one.
Good
Sorry,
point.
Kyle.
All good. Thanks for taking that one, Veronica. So now that we have seen how to actually set up our repository, how to connect to it, what those actions do, let's actually use those actions and push something to our repository. So I'm going to click over to it real quick and drop down this designer repository folder so we can see what projects are in it. I was doing some testing before this webinar, which is why you see those folders. But what we're going to do is push this webinar folder to our repo. Now I'm going to run this flow real quick, just so we can see what it does. I have a simple pop-up just displaying congrats, the day of the week is Thursday. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to right-click on this folder, go to those designer repository actions, and you'll notice we have different options now. And that's because these items are not tied to a project yet. So we don't have project-specific actions. So when I click Add to Project, I can either select an existing one or create a new one. And this is similar to what happens when you export items. When I click Continue, similar to the export, you can decide if you want the folder or all of the content with the dependencies. And when I click Next here, I could choose what dependencies. I do not have any for my project. And now I can see everything that will be committed to my repository. And when I click Commit, we have the last screen, or this last screen pop up, which has to have a comment. So I'm just going to say this is the first push. And I can see all the items that are here and decide to include or exclude them from my push. So I'm going to click Commit. And we could see that everything was successful when it was sent. We completed that revision. And let's go back over to our repository, and we could see that that webinar folder has successfully been pushed to it, and this project is now in our repo. So now that we are in this repo again, let's go over how we can actually manage our versions within our repository. And then we will be showing how you can pull those different versions back into your local instance of decisions. So I'm here on the trunk folder of that webinar project, and I will be creating another branch soon. But I just want to talk about these two different reports that we're seeing here of the commit history and our resources. The commit history on the left, when I right click into that, I have these different options where I can see what resources might be modified and get zip files of those exports. And I have the ability to actually roll back or revert to a different revision. And this is how you would be doing that versioning control, where you can roll back to another version. Instead of just rolling back on an entire project, on the right, you can see all of the resources that are associated with it. And when I right click into these, we see the actions available to update our individual resources, or we can delete them. And delete has two different options where we can either just have a flag raised that says, hey, this is not a part of the project anymore, but our repo would still know that that item was associated with the project in the past, or we can just delete that item completely and the project will not know that it ever existed in it. So depending on what the behavior you're trying to manage when you're doing your versioning control, you have a few different options, as well as just downloading each individual resource in case you needed to see what was up with them.
All right, so I'm just want to make sure I'm clear on all this. So those revisions on the left on the report, those are the different check-ins. And then you have your resources on the right.
Correct.
Okay, and then now I know we can replace that. So one of the things I know people bring up to me, and I'm just going to point this out, is when they're dealing with, let's say, maybe there's a resource that has an issue. It's not opening correctly, something's wrong with the particular resource. So I did see those actions where you can, could you right click on one of the resources
Sure
where
thing.
you can update that resource. This is where you would be able to bring in a patch, for instance, or update that resource. So maybe we wanted to just simply bring in a new form here, or whatever this particular resource happens to be. This would be where we could add that in. So I think a lot of people have asked in the past about how can I just update one single item. You are able to do that right here in the repository, but you also can do it within that dev environment and send, like Kyle had mentioned earlier.
Great points, Veronica. And rather than just making changes to each individual resource, we're now going to be making some changes to our entire project. I'm going to make a new branch so we can see that push and pull behavior from our local and how things update. So I'm just going to right click on this revision here. And what I'm going to do is create branch from this revision. And what that's going to do is it will just allow a new branch to be created. So that way I will have another version that I can refer back to and revert to if need be. So I'm just going to create a branch and call it version 1. And you'll see in our webinar folder that we now have another folder called version 1 underneath that trunk folder that we have where that was the original version of our project. So we created a new branch successfully. And how can we now access that branch within decisions? So I'm going to move back into my studio and go into System, Designers, and then Repository. And this page will just show me all of the items that are currently in my local, but have also been pushed to our repository. You'll see we have a few different tabs at the top where we can see the projects and branches, or all of the resources for each individual project, or even an audit trail of every action that was taken on each of these projects and individual items. But we're just going to go back to this projects and branches, and I'm going to find that webinar project, right click it, and then we have the option of change branch. When I click this, I can see all of the branches that have been created in my repo, and I can revert back to either of these. So I'm going to choose version 1 and change my branch. And then we're going to update. And you'll see that we can see the actions that will be taken when we decide to pull this version from our repo. And similar to when you're importing a project, it will just show you the screen to let you know what is happening as things are importing and downloading. So everything's successfully downloaded. Let's just import it all, and it has been completed. So it is very similar to importing items within decisions, but the repo just does it automatically for you, essentially. I'm going to go back into our webinar project folder now, and I'm going to actually click into our flow and make a minor change to it. And the change that I'm going to make is I'm just going to change the message that displays. And instead of saying the day of the week is Thursday, let's say it's almost Friday. Can we get a happy hour? So what this flow is doing is just seeing if our day of the week is Thursday. And if it is, then we're just displaying whatever message I decide to configure in this input step or in our display message step here. So I'm just going to close and save, run this flow just so we could see that it did change what our message was. It's almost Friday. Can we get a happy hour? So why did I go through all that trouble of reverting back to a different version and making this change? Well, I wanted to show that if I go back into System, Designers, Repository, and now I'm going to revert our webinar project back to our trunk instead of that version 1 branch. So when I change my branch back to the trunk, again, we just have to update it similar to importing an item. And after playing the Jeopardy theme song for a bit and waiting for everything to download, we do get to import everything again. And now we have this displaying showing me that, hey, you already have that resource of display pop-up message. Do you want to keep the local version? Or in this case, because we are updating, we will be overriding that. So I'm going to continue my import. It will show me everything here. No issues have been found. Let's complete that. That import was successfully completed. So now I'm going to go back to that webinar project folder, run our flow again, and we do get that message from our original version of the project where it's telling us, hey, the day of the week is Thursday. So that is how we can push and pull things to our repo. And there's one more thing about the repository that I want to talk about, and that is repository action flows. So I'm going to open our repository again, and I'm going to navigate in here to System, Designers, or sorry, not Designers, System, Admin, Repository Action Flows. And when I navigate here, you'll see at the bottom, we have this button here for flows where we can create these different options. So we can create a flow with logic to execute either before or after a project is created, or before or after a project is checked in. So what do we mean by that? I'm going to open up this before check-in flow 1 that I created, just to show you what's going to be happening here. I've just created a simple rule saying if the email of the user who is pushing to the repository is an admin, then we are going to allow them to push whatever they want to the repo. However, if they are not an admin, then we will get a message back telling us, sorry, only admins are allowed to update resources. So let's show that repository action flow actually in action. If you, in order to set these up, you do have to navigate back into your settings folder in your repository, open your designer repository settings, and you will see the option to choose which of these action flows you'd like to be running for each of these different options. So I'm going to open up my local instance of decisions, but this time I'm logged in as my personal account rather than an admin account. And you'll see that we have the Kyle.Bachner at decisions instead of admin at decisions. So navigating back to that webinar project folder, I'm now going to attempt to check in the changes for this project. So I just had to refresh real quick.
You just need to create your flow, extra flow.
Thank you.
No worries.
Lost place of where I was. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a minor change because we did revert back to that original trunk. When I try to push this to the repo, there's nothing to update now. So I'm going to make a change to this project by creating just a blank workflow. So that way there is a minor difference here. And now when I try to push to the repo, we can see that that flow 1 is the new one that we're going to push. This should not be able to update is just what the comment I'm going to put in. And when I try to commit, we see that that commit failed. And that's because, sorry, only admins are allowed to update resources in the repository. So you do have some control over allowing who can push things to the repository or defining whatever logic you need to. Maybe if you wanted a notification or an email sent to you every time something is updated, you could create an action flow to handle that kind of behavior. So it's really up to you and your organization to decide what makes sense when you're using the repository. But that is everything I have to talk about our designer repository within decisions. Now, Veronica, there are, of course, different repo options that are available. Do you want to talk about those real quick?
Sure. So I'm going to just take really about 1 minute to discuss the other options, but I do want to make sure we get to the Q&A because we have lots of questions, a lot of great questions that came in, and I want to make sure we get to them. So the other options, I know a lot of people that come to us, they're already using repositories. They're using Jenkins, they're using GitHub, they're using some other system that they'd like to continue to use. Are you able to use that other repository as your versioning control? Absolutely. You can absolutely be able to utilize that now. Downloading or exporting your resources or your projects into those zip files or into those deck object files, it'd be extremely important for you to have great naming conventions. And of course, the one thing about the other repositories is that you're not going to have those action flows that are going to help manually move things, or I'm sorry, automatically move things like you saw with our repository. But we do have a lot of customers who simply build out their own flows. They've made a connection to their repository using our integrations layer. Once that connection is made, then they create a workflow that they give their designers access to that can say, send to our repo and do the logic that makes sense for them. So you can absolutely use other repositories. It is, I think, a little bit more helpful to use the decisions repository because it's all the same, like I said, the same brand. It makes things a little more seamless because it is all decisions that are interacting with one another. Now, as I said, I do want to take time and answer a lot of these questions. And in fact, I do want to introduce another one of our colleagues. I have on with us Don Gray. Some of you may know him from previous webinars. He is one of the developers here at Decisions and actually one of the main developers for the designer repository. So welcome, Don. Are you able to, I just want to make sure I can hear you, and are you able to speak?
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Don. Thank you so much for joining us. So I know there's lots and lots of questions coming in, and a couple of them I think will be easy. Some of them may or may not be. So I'm going to go right down the line. So I know Pat had asked a little while ago, what's the retention policy on the automatic backups? So when you saw me doing the history documentation for those viewers at the beginning of this webinar, Don, how long are those automatic backups available? Do you know?
Automatic backups are stored the same way as checkpoint backups are, and they're stored in the history folder for a designer element in Decisions. And those are stored forever. I mean, Decisions does not automatically like expire them or delete them from the history folder.
All right. Now I know Trung has a question as well. His project has many resources, forms, reports, flows, and has some initial data, lookup lists, constants, and groups. Can the repository server store and sync these items from development server to production server?
Yes, it can. So you're able to add things to a project, using an action on various items, everything from designer elements, such as the forms, reports, and flows that you listed. But you're also able to go to, like, say, a lookup list and add that to a project. Some of the things like initial data and groups, those can be added to a project. Those by default sometimes are not. Because we've encountered some situations where that's caused some issues. Moving a project to production, they sometimes would want especially like the groups to be, very, to be separate. We also, by default, don't necessarily move some of the data. It depends upon what kinds of data. Like if you've actually, generated test data or something like that. By default, we tend not to include those in projects. because you don't necessarily want test data on your production server, sort of affecting your reports or anything like that. But yes, it is in fact possible to do that.
I think that's a great point about bringing certain items into production, making sure that there isn't irrelevant items that get moved into production.
Now, some of the next questions we have are about the best practices for using our repository, specifically with branching strategies and editing items directly in the repository. So branching strategies, that mainly will come down to what you and your organization feel comfortable with overall. Don, I don't know if you personally have a best practice with the way this was built, but I do think that does come down to your organization's preferences for how you guys decide to build things.
And the question actually lists two particular examples. One is to start on the trunk branch, move from the trunk branch to a branch A, from there to branch B, from branch B then to branch C, and sort of roll things forward that way. There's also another method that they list, which is to start at a trunk branch off to branch A, and then also to then go from the trunk to another branch B, or maybe it actually also says going from branch A back to the trunk, which I think would be a little. And I don't think I've actually seen that often in our customer base. But I've seen both of those different strategies used, and it depends upon the kind of software development life cycle you have. Some of our customers do the first example that I listed, that is they start in trunk, they go to a branch A, from there to branch B, from there to branch C. Those organizations tend to want to create a branch, a new branch every sprint, or if they have like some sort of other sort of some sort of development cycle that they have. They will create a new branch based off of wherever the previous branch ended, and so they always know which sprint a particular development environment or QA environment is on. Other things, and this is works I think a little bit closer with what like say actually what we do in decisions and also a couple other places, is we will have, there's a main trunk branch which exists, and then at a certain point it's decided that development work has been done, it's ready to go to testing and then eventually on to production. At that point, a branch is made from trunk, and all the development is done in that trunk branch. But it will be branched, and that branch will be given a version number. And then on the QA server, you would then switch to that new version number, do some testing, and then on production, you would just simply switch to that branch. And so at that point, the branch indicates sort of what release of your project a particular decision server is on. And then in the future, future development work continues on the trunk branch. So the trunk branch is always up to date. And then at another point, it's decided that it's time to release again. You would go to a different branch and it would be given the new release name. One of the benefits of that second example, besides obviously having a something that indicates exactly what the version of a particular project a decision server has, is that when you switch to that particular branch as part of like rolling to either into staging or into some other environment, if it turns out that there's some sort of problem that was missed or something that needs to get corrected, it's fairly easy to switch back to the previous version of the project. So it's just a way of sort of tracking that sort of thing.
That was very, very, very helpful. That to me makes that much more clear. Thank you so much, Don. Now I know we're running short on time. There was a couple of important questions I think I want to make sure that we hit on, that they're pretty easy and quick to answer. Is it a best practice to edit items in the repository? No, it is not. The repository should really be that central place of record where you're sending and pushing different resources to and from your environments. You shouldn't be developing anything in the repository, although it looks like very similar to your development environment in the studio. You shouldn't be building anything in the repository except for maybe those repository action flows. So you should refrain from editing things in the repository. You are able to update, and a use case for that was that, let's say something had a bug, some resource became corrupt or just isn't opening or isn't working correctly or the way it was supposed to, and that one resource needs to be, a new resource needs to replace it. So that would be the time when we came into the repo and updated it. But that's pretty much it. You really shouldn't be trying to create workflows or forms or anything in the repo. You should just be sending and pushing to and from the other environments. Let me see here. So not so much about the branching itself, but does decisions handle one method better than the other? Jeff, I'm not 100% sure about if you're saying is it better, one method is better than the other if you're talking about importing and exporting versus using the repository. If you could follow up on that, I'll answer that here in just a few minutes.
So Veronica, that question was referring to the different branching strategies that
Gotcha.
Don touched on.
Okay, perfect. All right. Any other questions here that we see that we want to answer? I know we're a minute over time, so Kyle or Don, if you see any that you want to answer real quick. Will this be posted in advance? Yes, we will be posting this on the website, and you can download that once it's been posted. It usually takes about a week or two for us to get it updated on the website.
One quick question I think I can answer is the one from Michael, which is asked, does changing branches and loading into the dev environment thereby lose the history that was connected to the initial check-in branch? And so in those instances, that's why the development branch, typically you do not change what branch you're on in the development environment, except if you're moving forward in like, that's, I guess, like the difference between the two branching strategies. If the development environment is always on the trunk branch, then you're never, the history is always there and the history is always active on your development server. If you're moving forward between sprints, then again, the history folder is still going to be there. You're just simply on a, you just simply switched to a different branch. And it's effectively the development environment is always matching what the current branch happens to be, the most recent branch. And it always keeps the history that way. And I don't know of many customers where they're trying to, in the development environment, try to switch back and forth between branches, especially that can get very confusing, especially when, as is typical, you have multiple people working on the project and you're all sharing a single development environment. That tends to get a little bit tricky to try to coordinate.
All right. I just saw in the chat, thanks, Don, you're the master. So you are. I appreciate your helpful input because, again, Don has a lot of insight due to the fact that he is one of the main developers behind the repository. I know there's just a couple of questions, but I do want to make sure if you still have some questions that haven't had an opportunity to be answered, feel free to email either them to myself, veronica@decisions.com, or kyle.bachner@decisions.com. We're happy to answer those if there were some that you weren't able to get answered today. I do want to thank Don for joining us and helping us answer all these questions because, like I said, we have a lot of information and we do know a lot, but it's always great to have an expert on the call. So thank you so much, Don. And for all of you that joined us today, we appreciate you joining us. I am going to open up the poll, the final poll here in just a second, and possibly. And so as you're leaving, there's just 2 or 3 questions. If you want to go ahead and answer those before we close up the webinar, please do so that we have an idea of how you felt about today's webinar and whether or not you'd be interested in attending future webinars. Again, we did just revamp the website, so feel free to look at our new branding and everything on the website at decisions.com. If you have sales questions, you can always write us at sales@decisions.com. If you have specific questions that are a little more technical, you might need to reach out to our support team at support@decisions.com. And with that said, thank you all for attending. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and close off the webinar, and have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend. Thanks,
Yes,
everyone.
take care, everyone.